Hey there, so today we'll take a look at diminished chords and how to use extensions on diminished chords. What are these extensions and how can we use them? Well, a diminished 7 chord has 4 notes in it, and the diminished scale, or the whole half scale, has 8 notes in it. That means that we have 4 extensions available to these chords. So which notes are these extensions and how can we use them? So let's take a good old E diminished 7 chord. We see this chord all the time, whether we're playing jazz or classical or whatever. So it's an E, B flat, C sharp, G. Above each and one of these notes, there is a note that we can use as an extension. The remaining notes from the whole half scale, right? So those extensions create a diminished chord in and of themselves. So you could say that the extensions create an F sharp diminished chord, or C, or E flat, or A, because it's symmetrical, right? You could play these 2 chords at the same time on a piano and create what's called a double diminished chord. I've done that in a previous video on diminished, one of my earlier videos, which nobody saw. So I'll post a link to that in the description below if you're interested in how that sounds. Anyway, so let's look at these extensions. I think the first one and the most common is to add the major 7. So the C sharp, a whole step above that is D sharp or E flat. So if we change that note, we create this voicing. Or here. You could look at that as an E flat over E. And that was the first extension I learned on diminished chord. It was like, oh, you can use a major 7 on a diminished chord, cool. So that would be a diminished major 7 chord. The top note here is a G. We could change that to an A. I'm not super big on this specific voicing because it kind of sounds to me like that note wants to resolve. That kind of thing. Then we have the B flat, a note above that is C, natural. Whoa, sorry about that. That was another voicing that is cool, but it was what I was looking for. Very interesting sounding voicing. And then finally, the E could be raised to an F sharp. But the problem with that is we're creating a bad voicing here because of the flat 9th interval. So, I mean, if you want to sound like Breathe for Yourself, go ahead. But you might want to change so that you put that note on top instead. You could also, this is a good voicing if you want to put that chord on top. Scott Henderson uses this voicing all the time. Or if you want to put that note on the bottom, you could go E, C sharp, G, F sharp. So hopefully you got some ideas for for voicings there. Some of you are probably thinking right now, well, why can't I do more than one extension? Sure you could. So let's take the A, for example, and the E flat or D sharp. So the thing is, though, in my opinion, now you're creating more of a diminished sound rather than a diminished functioning chord. So if you have a tune that, let's say there's an intro and it says diminished sound, or you're playing with people and they all kind of know what they can pick up on stuff like that. If somebody starts playing a diminished kind of intro, they all know, everybody knows what that is. Then you can use all these crazy voicings that are derived from that scale. But if you do too many extensions on a diminished chord, you might lose the actual function of that chord. So you might want to be aware of that. So let me give you an example. Let's say you play this very common progression, E minor, D flat diminished, sorry, D sharp diminished or E flat diminished, D minor 7, G. Like Body and Soul and many tunes has this progression. So the correct scale here wouldn't necessarily be the whole half, right? So I'm not going to get into which scale. I've talked about that, I've touched upon that before, but it's a little bit it's a huge topic, so I don't want to lose track too much here. But it's not, some of those notes, some of those extensions that we would add a whole step above this voicing are outside of the key, and therefore they sound kind of weird. But the D, for example, is in the key of C major, so therefore it sounds great in my opinion. So even better is the B natural. Then you get this interesting voicing. So a D sharp diminished, change the A to a B. And if you want to be really fancy, you play, instead of the E minor, you play C major 7 chord in first inversion, and then that chord. So the other inversions, like the A flat, for example, wouldn't sound that good in my opinion. Actually, if you go up, it works. But yeah, you just have to be a little bit careful when using those extensions. Now, let's move on to when a diminished chord is actually functioning as a dominant without its root. So we're in the key of A minor, for example. E7 flat 9 is the dominant chord of that. If we omit the root, we forget about the root, we're actually playing a G sharp diminished, or F diminished, or D diminished, or B diminished. You know, the classical sound, like A minor. So in this case, the chord tones are different, right? We have a G sharp is the third of E, D is the flat 7, F is the flat 9, and B is the fifth. If we add a note above each one of these notes, we get the sharp 9. Or the root. The C sharp. And this is a really funny note because it doesn't belong to the key of A minor, it belongs to the key of A major. So if we're in the key of A major, it works fine, but not necessarily minor. And then we have the B flat. Doesn't belong to the key either, but it sounds kind of good anyway because it has a strong dominant kind of function. Right, so I'll demonstrate. Let's say we have something like a tango, E7 going to A minor. So G sharp diminished, A minor. The G, the sharp 9, sounds great. And the root. But the C sharp is gonna sound a little bit funny, right? What you could do is you could do all of them like this. That's a lick for you. It's the same thing moving in minor thirds. So I'm adding the note above the highest note of the chord and resolving it down and moving the same thing in minor third. Now, let's say that we want to fix those notes that are outside of the key. The C sharp and the B flat are not in the key of A minor. The G is questionable because we are actually playing, instead of a whole half scale, we're playing the E Phrygian dominant. So there's no G in that scale. But I've talked about this before as well. The G kind of belongs to that scale because you could play what's called a Spanish Phrygian. So the sharp 9 sounds good in my opinion. You wouldn't find it in classical music necessarily, but for this I think it works. And the E works obviously. The C sharp, we're gonna lower to a C natural. And then the B flat, we lower it to an A. Oh, sorry. Then it sounds like this instead. Okay. Now that sounds more like something a tango guitarist would play, right? Or Django Reinhardt territory. Right? And as opposed to the other one. We have this. Then we could do the first one, go to major. Now, one last thing, I'll make it a little bit more intricate for those of you who are feeling that all of this is old and very lame and boring and uninteresting and too easy and what have you. So just make it a little bit more tricky here. Let's add some counter motion into the mix. So instead of this, I'm gonna have the G go up. So the G here goes down and this goes up. And then we get this. My camera is running out, so that was it. I shall see you next time. And my PDFs always on my Patreon page. So see you next time. Take it easy.